Hi, this is Misha, and I thought it was time we revisited the Swiss straight pull family, the Schmidt-Rubins and the K31s and so on and so forth. We did put out a video about a year and a half ago, and I have to say I appreciate that no one really commented on it or said anything, but from what Jay says, the videography there was pretty jerky and all over the place, and yeah, so I appreciate everyone's tolerance. I thought it was time we did a better job and used a mic and so on and so forth. So also we're going to split this up into a few different parts, and part one is on the original long rifles. On the table here, or in my hands at the moment, and on the table, we have the first model. This is the model 1889 Schmidt-Rubin straight pull. Chambered for 7.5 by 53 GP90. This was Switzerland's first smokeless powder cartridge. And we have a very similar model. This is the 1896/11. And this is chambered for 7.5 by 55 GP11. So let's get into the history of how these rifles came to be. First off, we have Rubin from the Schmidt-Rubin combo. In 1882, he worked on a couple of different small diameter copper jacketed bullets, cartridges. He did both 8mm and 7.5mm. This was revolutionary at the time because in the early 1880s, most militaries were using still quite large diameter projectiles, anywhere from 10mm up to 12 and beyond. And even that was quite a bit smaller than the old musket days. You know, the mini ball changed a lot of things and things started to get smaller, but you know, if you look back, you have calibers anywhere from 58 to 70 caliber before and during the U.S. Civil War. So that really helped scaling down. Of course, that was still for black powder. Around the same time, Rudolf Schmidt, was working on a straight pull bolt action system, so repeating system. Repeating rifles were not new. Switzerland was the first military to adopt a repeating infantry rifle for standard issue. This was the 1868 Vetterli, and they would go through several iterations of this over the next decade, resulting in the 1878 and so on. So they already had a black powder repeating rifle, but it was still a rimfire. Schmidt was working on a centerfire system, more modern, more up to date, also getting away from the tube magazine. And in 1885, Rubin's small diameter modern bullet was paired with Schmidt's straight pull system for the very first time, and some prototypes and theories and so on. However, just the next year, France adopted the 1886, the Melee or model 1886, often referred to as the Lebel. The rifle itself was not terribly remarkable, but its 8x50 cartridge was, because it was the first to use smokeless powder. Now, some nations, including Switzerland, had been working with black powder compressed into pellet form to try to get more velocity, pressure, and thus range, and they did. Actually, the compressed black powder delivered significantly higher pressures than standard just black powder. But when France came out with their version of smokeless powder, it really was a game changer in the truest sense. Immediately, every other European power would race to adopt a smokeless powder gun. Germany was very, very close on their heels with the Gewehr 1888, known as the commission rifle. And it was really good because it introduced a rimless round and it used a Mannlicher style in-block clip, both two distinct advantages over the Lebel. Likewise, Britain was working on first the Lee Metford, later to be redone with new rifling as the Lee Enfield. It was originally a black powder gun, but the last minute, the 11th hour, they reworked it for a new smokeless powder 303 round, adopting it in 1888, very late in the year, and so on and so forth. Eventually other nations like America and Japan would get in the game too. We have a video on the very first smokeless powder, so if that interests you, please check that out. As far as Switzerland, most nations, Italy comes to mind, would select the cartridge first and then develop a rifle around it. Well, Switzerland was a little different. Now again, Rubin and Schmidt had been working together in a certain sense for several years, and this was the version of the Schmidt action that would be adopted. This is a model 1889. It was also officially adopted in 1889. Now, in addition to the straight pull action itself, which we'll get into the mechanics of later, Schmidt also designed this magazine feed cutoff, pushing it up and then moving it down to let your magazine come up and down. This is also removable, not for swapping mags out, but for simple maintenance, cleaning. And it holds 12 rounds. It is a double stack, double feed, which is actually quite modern for the day and time. And he even developed a charger system to feed this, top this off with. Now, his chargers held 6 rounds each, and they're not Mauser style. They're very distinctive. Any of you who've done Swiss guns, they're very easily recognizable. Okay, so they have the rifle in 1889, selected and adopted. What they didn't have was the cartridge. By its name, you can probably guess, GP90, 7.5 by 53, wasn't officially adopted until 1890, so a year later on the calendar. This was a true smokeless powder cartridge. It was a quite small diameter. Originally, it was paper patched. Very high quality. Accuracy was considered to be very important in Switzerland. Always has been since the beginning. It still is today. And now that we have both the rifle and the cartridge adopted, everything would go into mass production in 1891. Now, the Schmidt-Rubin rifle would see limited production for prototype testing and all that starting in 1889, but it wouldn't really enter into mass production until 1891. In that year, they would produce about 20 to 25,000, so not an insignificant number. And these would start to get into the field around the following year. It's a very interesting design. It's very long, as you see. It has nearly a 31-inch barrel. Quite unique for the time, it has a true full handguard, upper handguard. A lot of the rifles of the day either had a completely exposed barrel, or they had a small handguard just held on with clips. This is a really good, solid, dependable handguard. The rear sights are very easily adjustable, as you see. They go up quite high. You just squeeze a button on the side to lift, and when you have it where you want, you just let off and it locks in to the appropriate notch. We have a stacking rod here. We have a very traditional bayonet lug. We have a front sight blade. Bottom mounted sling swivel, of course. We have quite a large receiver. You can see some lightning cuts cut into it here. Back here we have a safety and cocker. You can recock it this way. You can also hook it there for safe. And then back here for cock. And you can even use that as an effective decocker. We'll look at the bolt in a bit. We have a Bakelite beer keg cocking handle. We already talked about the magazine. This does easily remove, as I said. You just pull it down and then press Here's your mag. It is self-contained. It doesn't go springing like some of the other mags of the day. It's a pretty advanced mag, really. And then to reinstall, you just seat it back in and press in, and you're good to go. But they did not issue multiple mags. They just had the one. Very nice trigger, quite wide, very ergonomic for its day and time. We have a straight wrist stock, as you see. We have a rounded and slightly cupped butt plate made of steel. And then we have a very traditional bottom sling swivel. Between 1891 and 1897, they would produce 212,000 of these for the Swiss Army, and a handful of others for private purchase, commercial, shooting club type activities. This was Switzerland's first smokeless powder rifle, and like most of the first generation guns, it was not in frontline service for very, very long because it was the first and they were still working out some things. So that's where this gun comes in, and this gun's gonna have to kind of stand for other guns. Quickly, a problem was discovered, and by quickly I mean before this thing was even adopted. As early as 1888, people had concerns about the bolt configuration, specifically where the lugs were located. Pull this out, I guess, now. As good a time as any. These bolts come out extremely easily. You just press this down and there you go. It's one of the heaviest bolts around. It's actually not as complicated as you'd think. It's just very large. There's way more than some pistols, though. As you see, the lugs are at the extreme rear of the sleeve, which is quite close to the rear of the bolt, meaning they lock towards the rear of the receiver, and when you fire, you have all this force on this thinner piece here, and then it gets transmitted to all of the sleeve, including where the cutouts are at. And they were concerned that this would put undue stress and lead to issues. Well, Schmidt said, no, this is not going to happen. This is fine. It works great. He showed that it did meet the pressure requirements for GP90. So then 1889 went into production, and quickly they started to have issues. Most critical, they would have bolt lugs shearing off. Now, under optimum or normal situations, yes, GP90 wasn't too much of a powerhouse for this bolt system. However, what if you have a hot loaded cartridge, a squib, a casing blown out? I mean, the metallurgy and the casing technology of the day was just out of its infancy. If it wasn't an infant, it was still a toddler. So defective cases were still quite very common in the 1890s. Just ask Paul Mauser. On top of that, if you had any kind of bore obstruction, grime, dirt daubers love to get in bores if you leave them alone, snow, ice, anything, it would increase the pressure. And you never know, there could just be metallurgy flaws. So this was close enough to the edge that if there's anything to up the pressure, it would shear off a bolt lug. Obviously, this wasn't terribly acceptable. So what they did in 1892, since Schmidt wasn't really willing, he didn't see a problem with his gun, so he wasn't really willing or desiring to work on it. They talked with someone else in the military, Colonel Vogelsang, or Vogelsang, I've heard it pronounced both ways. They asked him if he could strengthen the Schmidt action, and this is what he came up with. A very simple, at least seeming, we'll get into that in a minute. If you notice, the bolt lugs were simply moved from the back of the sleeve to the front. This seems like a simple fix. By doing this, we're taking all this pressure off the sleeve. We're locking in the front. We're also taking pressure off the rear of the receiver. And we still have this big stem, but it's not so bad. We can work around that. Now, Schmidt warned that this would not be an easy conversion. That's why he didn't want to do it. And to his credit, he was really right. They would make 50 prototypes and test these in 1895. Now, they noticed stronger lockup, which led to better accuracy, at least they claim so, more dependability, durability, and really a very, very lessened chance of lugs being sheared off. However, moving those lugs required more changes than they really had originally banked on. So in a lot of ways, Schmidt was right. At first, they thought they could just convert older 1889s with the new locking system, but they were quickly disabused of that notion. They discovered that in addition to a new sleeve, they had to do a new firing pin. Okay, that's not such a big deal. But then they also had to redesign the way the receiver was cut internally. You would first think that you could just cut the grooves further forward in the receiver, but as it turns out, they actually had to redesign the whole receiver, and it ended up being nearly an inch shorter, about 20 millimeters shorter, because of where the bolt lugs lock now. As a result, since there's a screw running between here, the trigger guard also had to be changed. It was moved forward, and they had to extend the buttstock out nearly an inch. So they had to go to a new buttstock, they had to go to a new receiver style, a new trigger guard style, a new trigger style. Well, not a new trigger guard per se, but they had to move it forward. They had to rearrange quite a few bits. This is why they couldn't just retrofit old 1889s. This model was known as the 1889-96, and it was basically this exact gun here. Same same barrel, same sights, same 12-round mag, but it had the shorter receiver of this gun here. So the 89-96 would go into production around 1897, and they would build about 137,000, just a smidge over. They actually did not replace older 1889s. These remained in service because they were still functional guns. But as new soldiers were trained, they would issue the 89-96. So these would slowly start to come into service in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they would again keep the 1889s around. Now, before we move on too far, the 1889s would still remain in pretty active service until at least the 19-teens, 1920s. This is when you see most of these being surplused out. And by surplus, the Swiss military operates differently. You can look that up on Wikipedia. And there's several great YouTube channels about how the Swiss military is organized. So when I say surplus, I don't really mean surplus like we're thinking, being given to the CMP or a Swiss equivalent. Most of them were allowed for private purchase, but not right away when they were still cutting-edge guns. And as these, first the 1889 and then the 96 came into service, this allowed the latest versions of the Vetterli, still on black powder, to be shifted over to reserve units and defensive guard type volunteer units. So by the 20th century, Switzerland's military on all levels had some kind of repeating rifle, even if some were still firing 10.4 black powder. At least they had a repeating rifle. And that brings us to this rifle here. This is a 1896/11. Something probably a lot of you are quite familiar with. Okay, so we adopt the improved bolt system, but we're still firing GP90. As early as 1903, many in the Swiss Army feel that they can do better as far as a cartridge. Remember, accuracy and range are very important to these people. GP90 was quite good by the standards of the 1880s, but already by the early 20th century, it's starting to look a little dated. And then Germany adopts a Spitzer cartridge, and many other nations follow suit. So in 1907, Waffen-Bern is assigned to develop a new cartridge, and thus perhaps a new rifle. What they came up with was GP11, the cartridge we know today, 7.5 by 55. This is very similar to GP90, except we're using a newer style of bullet, a Spitzer bullet, and we're using more modern propellants, and we're getting better velocity, range, and a flatter shooting trajectory. Well, to fire this new round, we need a new gun, and that's where this comes from here. What they did, as you can see, this is a very similar gun in a lot of ways to the 1889. We still have a nearly 31-inch barrel, still have a stacking rod, cleaning a bayonet lug, exposed front sight, full-length handguard. We've gone to a new pattern of rear sight here, more traditional, sliding ladder. This receiver is an 89-96 receiver. When they did that bolt change, when they moved these lugs forward, they were able to get the action strong enough that it was able to endure a much higher pressure cartridge like GP11. So we actually didn't have to change much at all of the receiver. So that was actually an economy much later in time than they probably hoped, but ultimately the 89-96 was done well enough that they didn't have to redesign the receiver. We did go to a new trigger guard because we're using a new pattern of detachable 6-round magazine. It's shorter, lighter. This is actually inspired by some of the earlier carbines, short rifles. We'll talk about that in a separate video, but it was made standard here. We even played with the idea of doing a new stripper clip system. The Schmidt version worked well enough, but was more expensive than they'd hoped, so they actually cut these to take a Mauser pattern stripper clip. They tried this out, but it actually never went much of anywhere. But you'll see it on the 9611. Moving back, we have the original stock here, but they got rid of this straight wrist. They cut it off here, and then they grafted on a semi-pistol grip, much more modern style. And then, of course, they're Swiss, so they did an excellent job of grafting it to give it a little better ergonomics, and so on and so forth. Now, the first guns to fire GP11, the first rifles, were converted 89-96s. In fact, they would convert all of them except for under 1,300. So you have 135,000 plus 9611s converted beginning in 1911. Now, as they were converting all these over, and they still needed more rifles, they would build guns that were wholly new. And these are what we call today Schmidt-Rubin 1911 rifles. They would be identical to this because they're using the exact same barrel. When they converted the 96s, they just put a new barrel on with sights installed, so we're using the same barrel. Receiver doesn't change. The only real way besides serial numbers to tell a 9611 from a 1911 is this semi-pistol grip won't have any lines where it was grafted on. It'll just be part of the stock from the get-go. And we're going away from this more rounded, cupped butt plate to a flatter butt plate. So 1911 has a flatter butt plate. So very few differences. From about 1913 to about 1919, 1920, they would produce 127,000 new, wholly new 1911 rifles. So, taken as a whole, we have about 265,000 rifles in Swiss military service in the 1920s firing GP-11. So this was standard issue during the time period of World War I. And all the older 8996s were converted except for, like I said, under 1,300, plus a few in private hands. So we still have quite a few 1889s left because you can't really convert these. So these would remain in ever decreasing numbers in ever more auxiliary service. Interestingly, in 1923, they would introduce a slightly updated version of the GP90 cartridge called GP9023, which did away with the paper patching. So even though the rifles were out of production and were getting more and more out of service, they did make ammunition for them. Of course, a lot of this would go to competition shooters and whatnot in Switzerland because of the passion there for that. However, in 1934, the Swiss Army would officially declare GP90 obsolete, and the few remaining rifles would be officially retired out and sold off, private purchase, whatever. They had one little twilight career during World War II when every rifle was needed in case Germany decided to invade. Some 1889 rifles were used by volunteer home guard type units in Switzerland. I'm sure these were never fired in anger, of course, but they did see a small resurgence in World War II. But after the war, that was it. They were gone. The only time you would see an 1889 would be in just a shooting competition in Switzerland. The 9611, on the other hand, would still remain in frontline service through the 30s and 40s. It would not be officially declared obsolete until 1953. And many would still stay in service in one version or another, reserve unit or not, up until the 60s. So they had quite a long, distinguished career. These proved to be quite accurate, well, very accurate for a military service gun. Very nice trigger. Very strong bolt. And typical Swiss quality engineering. So that's part one in our series. We'll revisit some of this in later episodes. I just thought these guns deserved a little second chance on the channel. I know a lot of you out there own Schmidt-Rubins, so we'd love to hear about yours. These are fantastic shooters. 7.5 is a really excellent round, and you can still find surplus ammo available. In fact, it's really match grade ammo for the most part. It's really, really good quality. These have excellent triggers, very smooth bolts, and aside from some honest wear, usually on the wood, these tend to be in very nice condition. Well, and these just have a bolt hold open if you see a follower built into the mag. Well, if you liked the video, please click like, and also check out other episodes. If you have not already subscribed and can do so, we'd really appreciate that. As always, this is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.